original question was as on the order paper, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the original words stand part of the question. John Nicholson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome this opportunity to speak about the BBC in the aftermath of the publication of the Government's White Paper on Charter Renewal and the Secretary of State's appearance yesterday before the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, of which I am a member. We on these benches are passionate defenders of public service broadcasting and independent journalism. And so, throughout the Charter Renewal process, the SNP has engaged constructively in the debate about how the BBC can be protected and improved. At its best, the BBC is unsurpassed. Since its foundation in 1922, the BBC's mission has been, as we all know, to inform, educate and to entertain. It forms one of the cornerstones of all our national lives. In our homes daily, it can be both an intimate friend or sometimes an infuriating relative. But we are proud of it at its best, not least for its world-renowned reputation. Any organisation which is successful over such a period of time must adapt. It must be able to embrace changes in technology as well as changes in the society in which it operates. Charter renewal allows the BBC and Parliament to take stock and assess what the BBC is doing well and where it needs to improve. For some on the benches opposite and in the press who dislike the BBC, the process holds out the opportunity to attack the corporation's core functions. And indeed, during the Charter renewal process, we saw some wild notions floated. Some, of course, were newspaper fabrications. Others were clearly the result of government kite flying. All of us know how this works. Ministers are able to float fanciful notions for radical reform and assess the reaction before the Secretary of State fans himself with full horror and tells us that, of course, he had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the ludicrous and impractical proposals splashed across the pages of the madder right-wing tabloids.
Remember, give way.
Yes.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I know he is a bit of a cheerleader for the BBC, but does he have any constructive criticisms for them? Because they aren't unsurpassed in many, many ways, maybe at their best, but their best is not 90% of the time.
Well, I'd like to thank the honourable gentleman for teeing up the rest of my speech. This is what is known as opening paragraphs, where I say something nice before heading further south for a good kick where it is well deserved.
Sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe the honourable member had just replied, but I'm told he had not. So. I'll carry on that basis. Can I just ask the honourable member, he references the government creating some of the headlines in the right-wing press, as he put it. Can I ask him what logic there would be for doing so and then not delivering to that end? It strikes me as being completely illogical and therefore very unlikely that the government had put those points in.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm touched by the honourable gentleman's naivety. Let me explain the way it works. Politicians sometimes talk to journalists. They say things that they don't want to be quoted as saying. The journalist then report it. If it floats, the politician then goes on the record. If it doesn't float, the politician backs away from it. That's generally the way it works, and I'd be happy to introduce him to journalists that he might find useful in this regard over the coming months. In the end, and this is where I disagree to some extent, I'm afraid, with the Labour Shadow Secretary, the White Paper is a relatively unambitious document. And I suspect this may well disappoint the Secretary of State, who many think may have wanted a more radical legislative legacy. Now, there are a number of welcome proposals in the White Paper, and I'm far from a cheerleader for the BBC. The BBC does many things which are good, but the BBC also, and we discovered this in Scotland during the referendum, which I'll touch on later, does many things which are much less good. But we welcome the abolition of the BBC Trust and its replacement by a unitary board. However, like many members of the House, I'm worried about the composition of the new board and its independence. How will non-executive members be chosen? Can we be certain that they will not be subject to party political pressure? Well, we have had worrying indicators already. the National Portrait Gallery in London was recently looking for a new trustee. The selection panel, in a blind sift, rejected all 5 of the government's preferred candidates. The Secretary of State then blithely dismissed the selection panel in its entirety and appointed a new one, which pleased him rather more. Now, I pressed him on this during his appearance at the Select Committee yesterday, and he told me that the panel had been dismissed because of a technicality. Although he hadn't necessarily wanted to influence the selection board, he did want them to know who his preferred candidates were. This is policy masquerading as process. What would happen at the BBC, I asked. Would this happen at the BBC specifically? Now, it seemed obvious from his reaction that it would. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't want independent selection panels for the BBC board to know who the Secretary of State's preferred candidates are. I want the BBC board to be entirely independent of government. And I'm worried by the evidence that the Secretary of State gave at our committee yesterday, as anyone should be across all parties in this House who cares about the independence of the BBC. Yes.
Would he not see that the other side of the coin which he's describing is that the BBC, given the bias which exists within it and the fact that it will be able to choose half of the members and the other half will be chosen by the Public Appointments Committee, that the real danger is that the BBC will simply continue on its merry way, choosing the board, half of the board from the cadre of people which it most believes reflect the kind of BBC values, many of which people reject at the moment, whilst there will be a diversity of people chosen by the Public Appointments Board.
I'm afraid that's simply called editorial independence. There should be board members chosen by the BBC who are independent and not subject to politicians' pressure. However, the ones who are non-executive members should be entirely independent as well. And what worried me yesterday about the Secretary of State's evidence was that he showed willingness to apply political pressure on the non-executive board members, and that is something that everybody across the House should be disturbed when they hear. I'll take the Secretary of State.
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman. I'm just puzzled. Is he suggesting that the Scottish Government should give up its right to have a say over the appointment of a non-executive director on the BBC board?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm absolutely delighted for the Scottish Government to have a say. My objection, however, is something different. My objection is for political pressure to be put on the appointments, specifically and mainly in the main board, because obviously, as we all know, the main board, with the number of members that it has, will be enormously powerful. In fact, the Secretary of State yesterday argued how different this board would be from the previous trust. He said this board will have real teeth. Therefore, it is vital that we should have fully independent board members, specifically the non-executive ones, that the government wishes to appoint. Yes, I'll take that.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way once again. I just want to know what he thinks, actually, just very simply, whether or not the new BBC board is more or less accountable and more or less democratic than the outgoing BBC trust.
Yeah.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the answer to that is we don't know as yet. That's precisely why I'm addressing these concerns in Parliament today, because if the non-executive board members are truly independent, then of course it's a great thing. But the evidence that the Secretary of State gave yesterday was worrying for the reasons that I've given. Now, trust in the BBC is, after all, crucial. And it's no secret, as my honourable friends have mentioned, that many in Scotland have been suspicious of BBC objectivity in recent years. The Secretary of State said a short while ago that a majority verdict in Scotland, although he acknowledged a lesser number, were pleased with the BBC. But let me give you the figure from the BBC Trust itself. The BBC enjoys only a 48% satisfaction rating in Scotland, less than half for those who are numerically challenged. Now, sometimes criticisms of the BBC in Scotland have been fair, sometimes criticisms have not, but the BBC itself, and the Secretary of State acknowledged this, has a problem in Scotland. So we welcome other proposals in the White Paper. Licensed services issued by the new regulator Ofcom will include specific regulatory provision for all the nations. Out-of-London quotas will be maintained, which should enable a healthy independent production sector in the nations and regions. The BBC's network television supply target will be 17% for content spending in the nations, with spending proportionate to the population of each nation. Now, this suggests some progress in adapting the BBC to the changing needs of these islands in 2016 and beyond. Of course, many of the changes required must come from within the BBC itself. There are proposals for the creation of a BBC Scotland board overseeing dedicated nation-specific services. Now, this would help devolve decision-making, increasing the likelihood of relevant and reflective content suited for distinct audiences. We welcome the idea of a separate Scottish board as proposed. We want to see a BBC that is editorially independent and well-resourced, a BBC that is bold and creative, and crucially a BBC that is representative of and delivers for both Scottish and UK audiences as a whole. With a more responsive governance structure, we believe that the BBC would be more nimble and better able to address the concerns of audiences.
Honourable friend give way?
Yes, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. My honourable friend will be aware that the Chancellor very recently cut £1 million without warning from the budget of BBC Alaba, the excellent Scottish Gaelic media service, which rather flies in the face of the stated support for BBC Alaba in the White Paper. Does he agree that this throws the government's motives towards the BBC more generally into question?
Well, I'd like to thank my honourable friend, and I do agree that this was most disappointing because BBC Alaba is a fine product and is universally admired across all parties in Scotland. The Gaelic language is, of course, a struggling language, part of our national culture, and every opportunity that we can have to enhance, embrace and support the Gaelic language, especially on television, should be taken. Yes, I will.
Thank you, Member for giving way. Does he not agree with me that it's in all our interests that we have a board that reflects the entirety of the society that we're in? And to have a board that will be filled and packed with lefty lovies does his cause and my cause no good. And that it would be right for the Minister at times to ensure that there might be someone who's centrist or even maybe slightly to the right on that board.
Well, I think the honourable gentleman does himself down. Perhaps in Northern Ireland he's seen as a radical, but here I've always seen him as a centrist lovey myself. I think, of course, that the BBC should. I think the BBC should reflect the society in which we all live. And we recently, I'm sorry, the honourable gentleman has just mentioned deselection. I didn't mean to be quite so wounding. I think, of course, as we all saw in our recent debate about BME and lesbian and gay representation, something I know that the honourable gentleman cares passionately about, I think that we are keen to see more equal representation at all levels in the BBC, from presenters to management and, of course, on the new board. Now, combined with greater financial commissioning and editorial control, we believe that the BBC in Scotland can provide relevant, reflective programming and support our nation's creative industries. We believe that bringing the BBC closer to viewers and listeners in Scotland is the best way of ensuring that trust in and satisfaction with the BBC and making sure that it's rebuilt and retained. Now, let me turn, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the issue of news provision in Scotland, because I think this lies at the heart of the problem of trust for the BBC in Scotland. Now, some members of the House may know that I spent much of my previous career in television news and current affairs. I reported for On the Record, Panorama, Assignment and Newsnight, and presented BBC Breakfast and ITV News. I am passionate about editorially independent news. So I speak as a friend, albeit a critical one, when I say that I do not think that the BBC covered itself in glory during our referendum on independence. The model for coverage was wrong. The BBC treated a binary choice as though it were a traditional election, and proponents of the status quo were subjected to much less scrutiny than those who wanted constitutional change.
Honourable Gentleman give way. Isn't this really simply the fact that the BBC had the gross audacity to point out that an economic plan based on $100 a barrel was frankly nonsense?
Madam Deputy Speaker, that's a soundbite. That's not an answer to the arguments that I was putting forward. So let me repeat it. Let me repeat it again. The problem was that the BBC treated the referendum coverage not as a binary choice, but as a traditional election. The BBC recognises that it made a mistake in that. Let me tell you how the BBC recognises that. The BBC, on the one hand, says we make no mistakes whatsoever in our coverage of the referendum. But then simultaneously, the BBC says we must learn the lessons from the Scottish referendum in the way that we cover the European referendum. And they tell me now that that is what they've done in the current coverage. You cannot both say that you made no mistakes in covering the Scottish referendum and say simultaneously that you will learn mistakes from it. It is intellectually incoherent. Yes.
I thank the member for raising this point. I think he's absolutely right on this matter. And it goes to the heart of where the BBC is actually critically wrong, because that coverage could have determined the outcome of the electoral process. It happened in our country in 1998 when Alistair Campbell flew to Belfast and said he could rely on his friends on the BBC and in the press to do the job of the government for him. And it's at that point where the BBC has lost all credibility and why today it stands in a shambles in Northern Ireland.
Well, I think there's widespread agreement that the BBC didn't do well in Scotland during the referendum. The corporation looked stretched and it looked dated. And there were fresh calls for what became known as the Scottish Six. Now, at the moment, in Scotland, the evening news on TV cannot cover any news item out with Scotland. So, Armageddon in Carlisle, well, the BBC Scotland coverage will lead on an air show in Carluke. Now, that's not the fault of the journalists, and I sometimes get emails from people saying they're upset when I say this. So let me make that clear. That is not the fault of the journalists. It's the fault of the remit, and it leads to toothy, entrenched provincialism. The BBC has been piloting a new grown-up programme which would cover news based on merit. It would have a normal remit. If the main story is a UK one, that will lead the news. If American, that will lead the news. If Scottish, that will lead the news. BBC Radio Scotland has done this for decades, and BBC Alapa has done this for a number of years. Yes, I will.
I'm interested in the argument that he's making, because most people don't think the BBC is biased. But however, could he give an example of where an example of where he has a grievance on a particular story which was biased, and then we can perhaps look into it and judge it on its merits? Just an example where he thinks they were biased. One example.
Well, it's not just a question of one example. It was a question of the ongoing nature of the coverage during the referendum. That was the problem, as I've tried to explain. The problem was an ongoing problem. But at the end of the day, you don't have to take my word for this. The fact that the BBC's approval ratings are so low in Scotland obviously shows that there is a problem. There's no point looking at figures that show 52% of people believe that the BBC doesn't cover the country well, and then say, well, it's just the SNP who's making a big fuss about it. It's a deeply entrenched problem in Scotland, and I think as somebody who loves independent journalism, who I hope has made it very clear in my earlier comments about the independence of the BBC, I hope that you'll take me at face value when I say I want to see an editorially independent BBC Scotland and indeed BBC network. Now, do you mind if I proceed just for a moment or two? There have been rumours of political interference emanating recently on the subject of the Scottish Six from worried BBC staffers. So let me remind the Secretary of State about our chats on the subject over the past few months. Now, charmingly, if candidly, he said yesterday at the Select Committee that he was, quote, not qualified to judge the BBC's output in Scotland or the reasons for its unpopularity, unquote. On that, we are agreed. He is not qualified. In March, however, he told me in this chamber that he agreed that increased investment and employment at BBC Scotland would be beneficial. Quote, I obviously welcome any investment at the BBC that will create additional jobs, especially in Scotland, unquote, he said. On that occasion, when I asked about the separate Scottish Six, the Secretary of State assured me that it was a matter for the BBC and neither he nor his colleagues at 10 Downing Street would want to interfere. I hope he recalls his comments, and he nods to say that he does. However, yesterday, when I pressed him 3 times at the Select Committee on whether he'd been talking to BBC bosses about the Scottish Seats or trying to influence them, his body language looked a trifle uncomfortable, and eventually he conceded something very different. He told me, quote, that he might have concerns if he felt that the central place of the BBC in providing a nationwide news bulletin was being changed. And he added, the BBC has a responsibility to bring the nation together, and news is part of that. Now let us just reflect on that line, that the job of BBC News is to bring the nation together. I couldn't disagree more. The job of the BBC, Madam Deputy Speaker, is not to be a cheerleader for one constitutional settlement or another. That's what's caused all the distrust in Scotland. The job of the BBC is to be editorially and journalistically independent. The Secretary of State should be playing no role whatsoever in trying to influence or block a separate Scottish Six. He himself stated several times that it should be a matter for the BBC and that he was not qualified to judge as he was not familiar with the BBC's output in Scotland. Such interference would undermine the statements made in the White Paper regarding improving the BBC services in the nations and restoring confidence there. It would show a blatant disregard and lack of respect for the constituent nations of the UK, including the devolved administrations who have participated fully in the Charter renewal process and in good faith. Furthermore, it would undermine the plans which the BBC is intent on implementing. So there we have it, Madam Deputy Speaker, a white paper with which we broadly agree, but worrying signs that the government wants to tamper with the editorial independence of the BBC in Scotland, and to tamper with the political independence of the proposed new BBC board in London. We on these benches will resist both, just as we will fight any upcoming moves to privatise Channel 4. Now, with Mr Speaker's permission, I'm heading now to the DCMS Select Committee to hear Channel 4's annual report and to offer them some moral support. Interference in the decision-making of the BBC by the government would put the independence of the BBC, a key feature of the organisation, into jeopardy, tarnishing its reliability and its reputation.
Order. There are